Syracuse is going to need some special performances and to keep the rebounding margin close to keep up with the big boys.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day, and we're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on today's show, we are going over the toughest parts of Syracuse's schedule, some of the toss-up games of Syracuse's schedule, and the gimmes for Syracuse basketball next season, and the keys for each category of those games. What does Syracuse need to do to get back into the NCAA tournament? We discuss on today's podcast. Let's start off with the big boys. And I believe that Syracuse will play 4 to 5 games against some of the elite teams in the country. And the reason why it's 4 or 5 is because I think we can all agree on at Tennessee is going to be super challenging. That might be the toughest game on the schedule. We went over them in the non-conference episode. Yesterday, we talked about how Duke and North Carolina, while those games are at home, are still very, very challenging. And then the reason why it's either 4 or 5 is because in the Legends Classic, they're going to play at least one of Texas or Texas Tech. They might end up playing both. We don't know how the bracket is going to shape out, but they're going to play one of them, the other team being St. Joseph's. So it's a 4-team tournament. In the Legends Classic, Syracuse will play at least Texas or Texas Tech, both of which are formidable opponents. At Tennessee is right now in the top 15. Duke and North Carolina in the top 15 as well. Texas Tech in the top 25, and Texas is on the border just outside the top 25. Honestly, they're pretty similar to Maryland, but I have Maryland more in the toss-up category. What are the keys for Syracuse in keeping up with these elite teams in the country? Well, first of all, it's to keep the rebounding margin respectable. I think Syracuse this offseason did a fantastic job improving the size on the team and getting more rebounding as a result. They brought in Eddie Lampkin from Colorado. He averaged 7 rebounds per game last year, and he's a pretty good offensive rebounder. If you look at his rate in which he offensive rebounds, he's actually better at offensive rebounding than defensive rebounding. You got to keep the rebounding margin close. Bringing in Eddie Lampkin is certainly going to help that. Jair Davis was an excellent rebounder for Delaware last season. He averaged between 7 and 8 rebounds per game, if I recall. Donnie Freeman was one of the best rebounders in high school last season. He was second in the EYBL league, only behind 5-star center recruit who actually is going to Maryland, Derek Queen. So Syracuse brought in guys to help the rebounding. And the reason why this is important, I know Syracuse has never won in Chapel Hill. It's like the ghosts and everything like that. They just can't win there. The good news is they're not going to have to go to Chapel Hill this season. They get to play them at home. When Syracuse went to North Carolina last season, they lost by 36 points. And they lost the rebounding margin by 23. North Carolina already has more talent. They do. And this season, I project that they will have more talent this year as well. They should be better than Syracuse, just on paper alone. North Carolina getting 23 more rebounds than Syracuse. Think about how many second chance opportunities you are giving a team that is already considered better than you. That's not a winning formula. Now, when Syracuse ended up upsetting North Carolina, what happened? They didn't win the rebounding margin. They didn't win it. But Syracuse only lost it by 8. Still, you're giving North Carolina second chance opportunities, but if you can keep it to a relatively respectable margin, you can keep up with the big boys. If you only lose it by 8, I know that's second chances, but that allows someone on the team to get hot, which leads me to the second point in keeping up with the bad boy, or not the bad boys, that's the Pistons in the 80s, the big boys on Syracuse basketball schedule. You got to get a star performance. This sounds obvious, but let me explain it to you. Syracuse did a great job this offseason in getting depth. They did. They can legitimately run 8-9 deep. I believe that. You got Jaquan Carlos, J.J. Starling, Chris Bell, Eddie Lampkin, Donnie Freeman, Jair Davis, Jaquan Carlos, Elijah Moore. Lucas Taylor was just added. I'm probably missing a few names, but you get the idea. Syracuse has a deeper roster than they did last season. That's a good thing. But against some of these elite teams in the country, this is what can separate the elite teams from the middle of the pack teams, which is where Syracuse is. They don't just have star players. They don't just have the best players in the country. They also have depth. Okay? These teams have depth too. They can also run 8-9 deep. And those players are better than yours. So just because you can run deep, that does work to your advantage against some teams, and we'll talk about it later on in the podcast. But against the deep teams that these big boys have, the depth doesn't matter as much. You need star performances. And what do I mean by that? Chris Bell hitting 8 threes. He's done that before. That would be something that's helpful against some of these big boys. That's how you can keep up with them. J.J. Starling going for 30 points. That would certainly help. When Syracuse beat UNC last year, J.J. Starling and Judah Mintz combined for 48 points on 65% from the field. That is the recipe to success. You need star performances. You need just outlier games. You're going against the best teams in the country. It's not enough to just play 8 players and hope that it works out. You need your star players to really be stars. This is the time where you can't take a day off. That's the key. Those are the 2 keys. As far as what Syracuse needs to do, don't get blown out. You can't get blown out against these big boys. I understand they're really good. Tennessee out on the road, Duke, Carolina, Texas Tech. You can't get blown out in these games. Last year, against some of the best teams in the country, I said Tennessee, Gonzaga, at Duke, at UNC, Clemson, at Clemson, UNC at home. So it was 7 total games that I mentioned here. Syracuse was 1-6. They did have that win at home against UNC, but they lost the point differential by an average of nearly 16 points per game. That includes the fact that they actually won a game in there. You can't get blown out. It does not help your net. The net matters. I know it's a flawed system, but they take point differential into account. And you lose it by 16 points against these elite teams. That's not good enough. You can't do that. You're going to get blown out maybe, but try to keep it close and keep the final score relatively close. You can be between 7 and 8 points, maybe sneak out a win here or there. There you go. So overall, looking at this season, I say that if Syracuse can win 1 to 2 games and keep every other game relatively close, and that's once again at Tennessee, Texas/Texas Tech, they might end up playing both, Duke and North Carolina at home. If they can win 1 to 2 games and keep every other game close, that is perfectly respectable. It won't cost them too much. It'll give them a quad 1 win in all likelihood. It puts Syracuse in the conversation to make the tournament next season. I think their greatest opportunity next year, it's also probably their toughest game on the schedule, is at Tennessee, just because they're probably going to be a top 15 team, and the fact that it's a true road game. It's probably the toughest game on the schedule, so that's your best chance to really get a resume-building win. That's what I got with the big boys on Syracuse's schedule. The keys are rebounding. You got to keep the rebounding margin relatively close, and you need your star players to have excellent games, or else you're really not going to win. Those are the keys. Just don't get blown out. Maybe you can sneak out a win or 2, and Syracuse can get back in the conversation for the NCAA tournament. Now, coming up, we'll talk about the toss-up games on Syracuse's schedule and how it's a little bit different than handling the big boys. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the streaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Welcome back, everyone, into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and on today's show, we are going over some of the keys for Syracuse basketball schedule in 2024-25. The last couple of days, we've gone over the non-conference games, we've gone over the ACC schedule, and now it's the overall takeaways from Syracuse's schedule. And by the way, I forgot to mention at the top, congratulations to O'Shea Brissett on winning the NBA championship with the Boston Celtics last night. He becomes the first player since Dion Waiters in 2020 to win an NBA championship as a Syracuse alum. So congratulations to O'Shea Brissett on winning the NBA Finals. Let's move on now to the toss-up games on Syracuse basketball schedule. And I have a lot of them here. Maryland in a neutral site, I think, is a toss-up game that can go either way. They're just outside the top 25. I kind of group them with Texas, but because Texas and Texas Tech, you get the idea, right? Maryland, I think, is a toss-up game. Georgetown, they still suck. Should be better. They have a top 30 overall commit class coming in, so I think that could be a little bit of a toss-up, but they get them at home this season. And finally, every single ACC game is a toss-up. You can never underestimate your opponent, but especially one within your conference. This is the ACC. I still believe it's the toughest conference in all of college basketball because it is so deep. There is a reason why every year they get disrespected by the committee. The ACC doesn't really get the benefit of the doubt anymore when it comes to the bubble, which is why the net is super important and not getting blown out is super important. You got to work within the system here. But then they get to the NCAA tournament, and these teams in the ACC make runs. It's not an accident. This is one of the toughest, if not the toughest conference in all of college basketball. Louisville has been terrible in recent years. They completely revamped their roster. Miami looks pretty good on paper without Norchad Omier, or even despite not having Norchad Omier. Hunter Salas, an all-ACC guard. I believe he made the first team over Judah Mintz. He's back with Wake Forest. There are plenty of solid teams in the ACC. So you can't just be like, yeah, that's a gimme win, that's a gimme loss, etc. Every ACC game you need to treat as, hey, you could lose it even if you're at home. So what are the keys? I think the main one here, it's the opposite from the fact that you're playing the elite teams. Use the depth to your advantage. Again, Syracuse can run 8, 9, maybe even 10 deep. You got Chance Westry, J.J. Starling, Jaquan Carlos, Donnie Freeman, Eddie Lampkin, Elijah Moore, all these guys, all these solid players that you brought in. I believe every single player that Syracuse has brought in is ranked 4 stars and on at least one recruiting site. Lucas Taylor, I know on On3, I think he is the lowest ranked guy that they brought in terms of high school recruiting and transfer portal. Even Lucas Taylor, I believe, is a top 200 recruit on 24/7 Sports, which would make him a 4-star there. It's just On3 super low on him. But regardless, good commit class coming in. You have some solid holdovers in J.J. Starling and Chris Bell. Use that depth to your advantage. Use it, because a lot of these toss-up teams, they have some good players, but they're not as deep. That's the difference right there. You can throw out different lineups. If something isn't working, you can do something different. I'm not saying you can't try to do that against the elite teams, but to win the toss-up games, you don't necessarily need J.J. Starling to have an incredible performance. That's the difference. Use the depth to your advantage. Throw out different lineups against these teams. There's a reason why the big boys are the big boys. They got the elite players, and they got the depth. And there's a reason why the toss-ups are the toss-ups. These are opponents that might look pretty similar to Syracuse. I think Syracuse, if you're looking at their roster, they might lack the top-end talent that they've had in years past. Right? They don't have anyone, I think, better than Judah Mintz on the roster. But they're so much deeper. So you might be going against teams that have one or two great players. You might go against a Wake Forest team that has Hunter Salas. But are they as deep as Syracuse? That's where you can take advantage. So use the depth to your advantage in those swing games. There's so many swing games on the schedule, I can't exactly give you a record prediction, but what I would say is that I believe the floor ceiling for Syracuse in the ACC next year is between 11-9 and 13-7, which is what I mentioned yesterday. That's probably about where they finish. And then if you can beat Maryland and Georgetown, you're looking at a pretty solid season, because coming up, we're going to talk about the Gimme Games and what Syracuse needs to do in those ones. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Day is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Day now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Welcome back, everyone, into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and on today's show, we are going over the main schedule takeaways for Syracuse basketball next season. We talked about what Syracuse needs to do against the big boys. We talked about what they need to do in the toss-ups, which is use the depth to their advantage that they have. They might lack the front-end talent that they've had in recent years, but they are certainly deeper. And now it's time to talk about the gimme games on Syracuse's schedule. And I know you don't want to overlook your opponent. You don't want to overlook them, but these are simply games that Syracuse has got to win. Who are the gimmies on the schedule? I'm going to put them in here, and I know it's dangerous. And I think I'm putting them in here because I expect this team to finally just get over this. Colgate. Can we stop treating Colgate like it's a toss-up game and just beat them? I know Syracuse beat them last year. It took a huge comeback by more than 20 points in the second half. And the previous 2 years, they lost to Colgate. But in prior years, they never really lost to them. Stop keeping it close with Colgate. Please, just beat this team. You're better than them. You have more talent than them. Next up on the gimmies, Cornell. Syracuse beat them by 11 last year. I'm not going to jinx it. Okay? I'm not going to tell you the exact number. But let's just say it has been a very long time since Syracuse had a poor result against Cornell. You can go look it up, what their record is against Cornell. But let's just say, yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't want to jinx it and say that, like, you get the idea. Albany. That's a win. You got to figure, right? St. Joe's, they're playing them in the Legends Classic, unless the bracket works out where they're playing Texas or Texas Tech first, and then they actually win that first game against Texas or Texas Tech, so then they play the other one. But they're probably going to play St. Joe's in the Legends Classic. It's kind of like last year when Syracuse went to Maui, and you knew how the bracket shaped out. Like they were going to play Tennessee in the first round. They were probably going to lose. So then they were going to play the loser of Gonzaga and Purdue. And Gonzaga ended up losing that game. So Syracuse was going to play Gonzaga. And then you figured that Syracuse would lose to Gonzaga. So then you played Chaminade. That's kind of how it is with St. Joe's on the schedule. You have to figure that they're going to play them one way or another, just the way regardless of how the bracket shapes out, unless they win that first game against Texas or Texas Tech. They will probably play St. Joe's. They have the 98th ranked commit class coming in. You got to beat them. That's a gimme game right there, even though it's neutral site. And then I added in this one because we talked about it in the non-conference takeaways. The last couple of games that Syracuse adds to their non-con, they got to be gimmes. You can put Siena on the schedule. You can put Lemoyne on the schedule. You can honestly just put games that you are supposed to win. Okay? Please, you don't need any more tough ones. They don't. They have a tough schedule. I don't know, and tough might be a strong word, but they have enough good teams on the schedule where they really don't need to add anyone else. Okay? You can put the cupcakes there. So those should be gimme wins. There are two keys. They kind of go hand in hand. First of all, don't lose. Do not lose. I beg you, don't lose. Syracuse last year went 9-2 in non-con. Their losses were to Tennessee and Gonzaga. That's good. They held serve. They beat the teams that they were supposed to beat. They beat the teams like New Hampshire, Canisius, Colgate, Cornell, Niagara. They beat those teams. Good. That's what you're supposed to do every year. Because the prior years, you would see a game on Syracuse's schedule and you're like, yeah, that should be a win. That should be a win. And Syracuse would end up losing. They would lose. It happens. Sometimes they would go to overtime. I believe a couple years ago, they lost to Colgate and then they also lost to Bryant at home. Like, you can't do that this year. Like, I know I say gimme games, but the reason why I'm telling you don't lose is because they have lost them before. You see upsets. They happen. Upsets do happen. These are still Division I athletes. But for all intents and purposes, you have more talent. Don't lose the game. Number two, obviously not as important as just winning outright. But again, style points matter. You got to blow them out. Plain and simple. You got to blow out these teams. As I said, Syracuse did a nice job holding serve against New Hampshire and Canisius and Colgate and Cornell and Niagara last year. They went 5-0. Good job. That's what you're supposed to do. That's what most teams in the country do when they play against those type of teams. So good. But their average margin of victory was only 10 points. It's not very good. And no game was more than 12. They really didn't blow out these teams. They either had to come back miraculously against Colgate, or they would be in control, but they would let the other team go on a run, and it would cause the end result to be maybe closer than what it appeared. But again, it's not about how it appeared. It's about what the end result is. If Syracuse and Cornell next year are tied with 10 minutes to go, but the Orange end up winning by 30 at the end, it's better than Syracuse in control throughout the game and wins by 9. That's just how the system is. You got to blow these teams out because Syracuse went undefeated, and that's good. And it certainly is a lot better than the alternative, which is losing those games. But you only win by a margin of 10 points per game against those 5. That doesn't help you. In fact, it actually can drop you in the net rankings. It can drop you. And then we know the net is used to determine NCAA tournament bids. It's not the end-all, be-all of it. But we know it's used. And there has to be a way to separate these bubble teams, as I have said, that have between 19 and 21 regular season wins. There's got to be a way to separate them. That's why style points matter. How you win, how you lose matters. That's why I say against the big boys, you got to try to keep it close. It's not a big deal if you lose, but if you lose by 30, that's a problem. And in the gimme games, that's when you got to win by 30 and hopefully not be super close with them. It's not enough to just win by 5 points. You've got to win in style. Overall, I would say the schedule is manageable. We talked about the advantages that Syracuse has in the ACC schedule, right? They get Duke and North Carolina at home, which is good. The Gimme Games are pretty similar to last season. You're playing Cornell and Colgate again. Albany, that should be a win by a lot. You got St. Joe's probably. That should be a win. You're going to add probably a couple more cupcakes to the schedule. Then they got a good blend of toss-up games. Maryland, Georgetown, they still suck. ACC competition. It's a good schedule. It's manageable. It's not like Syracuse football, which is the easiest schedule in the country, but it's manageable. It's one where I can easily see this team winning 20 games. When I did a poll Friday a couple weeks ago, you guys, for the most part, agreed that Syracuse would win at least 20. I would say that we're probably trekking towards a 21 to 22 win season because the team is deeper. And hopefully they can steal a game that they probably shouldn't. Hopefully. But overall, if there's a silver lining to everything that I said, I do think this team has the ingredients to make the NCAA tournament once again. I think the way the schedule shapes out, I think the way that they've constructed their roster, I believe this team will be back in the NCAA tournament in one way, shape, or form. I don't care how they get there, just get there. So that is it for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this video, click that like button. And if you really liked it, subscribe to the channel and turn on those notifications so you know right away when I'm dropping the next podcast. Tomorrow, we'll have another football episode. Not going to tell you what exactly I'm going to do, but it's another football episode tomorrow. Everyone, have a great rest of your evening.